Okay, this is the concluding chapter of Mark's Gospel. And one of the reasons I'm using it is because it concludes in such a very strange way. When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought perfumed oils so they could anoint Jesus. Very early, just after sunrise on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb. They were saying to one another, "Who will roll back the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked, they found that the huge stone had been rolled back. On entering the tomb, they saw a young person sitting at the right, dressed in a white robe. They were very frightened. But the youth reassured them, "Do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now, go and tell the disciples and Peter, Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, where you will see him just as he told you." They made their way out and fled from the tomb, bewildered and trembling. But they said nothing to anyone because they were so afraid. Well, I think that's a very odd ending for a gospel.
Yes.
Apparently, according to it, there were very important experiences which were kept secret. And that's mainly what happened on Easter. Now, of course, the other gospels contradict that in all kinds of ways. So what actually happened is very difficult to figure out. What did happen, and what we're going to talk about mainly, is that in the days after the crucifixion, the disciples, who you may remember really disappeared and went into hiding when Jesus was being tried and was crucified, none of the apostles were around at the time of the crucifixion. Only the women had the courage to show up and acknowledge their relationship to this crucified man. But within a short time after the resurrection, the disciples once again became disciples and had a new sense of what they were all about. And they worded it in terms of Jesus is not dead after all, he's risen. The first word we have, the first place you go if you wanted to find out what happened, is to Paul. Not that Paul was there at that time. He was still busy persecuting Christians. I think that had begun maybe even before Jesus' crucifixion. But he does summarize what happens, and he just says, Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to, and he begins with Peter. And then he goes on to say James, and then to a whole crowd, and last of all to me. So, and we know a little bit about the appearance to Paul, or at least we have some sense of it. So for Paul, apparently, the meaning of Jesus is risen is that he's around and he can appear to us from time to time. But that doesn't really suggest an empty tomb. So it's all very confusing about what actually happened. And I don't think that matters a great deal, because what we're really concerned about is that the disciples who were crushed when Jesus was killed, that meant that all that they had hoped for was over. That wasn't. They were all expecting Jesus to bring his kingdom in some visible way. And when that did not happen, Jesus died, did not perform any miracle to save himself, any of the things that they thought would happen, for them to come around and say, nevertheless, this person who did not do any of the expected things has come as God's word to us. The term Messiah, of course, is translated. We use the word Christ. And so Jesus did not do what a Messiah was supposed to do, but they figured out that what he had done was nevertheless of extreme importance to the world and to humanity. And so they took on a whole new mission with a whole new understanding. And that happened, that's Easter. Easter is the revival. It's certainly, we can say, there was a resurrection of the faith of the apostles. That would be a safe thing to say. Probably not all just on that one day, but over a period of time. And another safe thing to say is that the one disciple who was not officially one of the apostles, the one who stuck with Jesus to the bitter end, played a large role. All four Gospels insist she was the one who discovered that Jesus is risen. What our actual experience was, they don't agree with each other about that. And I don't think that's too important, but it is important to know that the fundamental in the person, actor, actress, with respect to Easter was a woman. It was the woman who was probably closer to Jesus than any of the disciples, closer to him in that she already understood. I don't think his death came to her as a surprise as it did to the apostles as a whole. So those seem to me to be solid historical judgments. But the topic I wanted to talk about was, so what? What difference has it made? And that's the point at which I'm suggesting we can think about the resurrection of humanity and the resurrection of nature. And I'm going to be talking more today about the resurrection of humanity. I have a chance to talk again next Sunday, very close to the official Earth Day. And I will speak more briefly about humanity and a little bit more about the resurrection of nature. But it's much easier to make the case that when Jesus was re-understood, the message that came through clearly was one which has, in fact, reshaped our planet, or the human elements on our planet. Now, this is a bold claim, but I think it is true. And I think we Christians have been so concerned that all other religious traditions should be given equal status with ourselves, that we don't recognize, but each one is different and does a different thing. So I'm saying that the inherent value of every human being is a message that it is the work of the followers of Jesus, which certainly learned it from Jesus, have played the primary role in making global. The contrast I want to talk about is a contrast between the Roman Empire, in which I have been told 80% of the people were slaves. In other words, it was a slave economy, and slave economies were not uncommon in the ancient world. And our time, when almost no one would admit that they are holding other people in slavery. That I won't say nobody, there's always exceptions. And certainly some people are really being treated as slaves today. So we haven't finished the job. But the fundamental assumption all over the world today is that nobody should be treated simply as the property of somebody else or of other people. The fundamental assumption in the Roman Empire was that, of course, most people were the property of other people, that their value was their value to their masters. Today, if I said, oh, the real value of somebody can be what you could sell them for, everybody would think I was nuts or worse, and probably worse. And it simply is not acceptable. Well, I really claim that that message was a distinctively Christian message. We get it, I think, very clearly in the Hebrew scriptures. Nevertheless, in the Judaism of Jesus' day, there was a very sharp distinction made between Jews and everybody else. And I won't say that that means that Jews taught that other people should be slaves, but the valuing of one community over others was not what has come to be in the world today. Of course, we all do it. It's awfully hard to say this in a way that is correct. There's so much that is not fulfilling what we claim. But Paul's statement, there is no, in Christ, there is no slave or free, is an idea that obviously was not implemented. In the Roman Empire, there was a huge difference between the masters and the slaves. And everybody accepted that. That was just the way the world was. They'd really probably would have a hard time imagine an economy in which all the work was done voluntarily by people. You have to have slaves in order to get the work done. Take it for granted. Now, this does not mean that the Christian message was at a serious, there was no serious effort on the part of Christians to reform the Roman Empire and liberate slaves. What they did do, and what I think we owe to Christ in human history, was to tell everybody that in God's eyes, they were human beings of personal worth. There is nobody who is simply valued by God according to what they do for other people, how much they're worth to other people. Now, when you don't try immediately to implement that, to make it actual, you might even say there's a certain hypocrisy, but I think that's not the right way to think of it. How people understand themselves and how they understand their relationships to other people operates at a very deep level. And in the church, I think slaves were not treated as inferior human beings. I don't know how often it happened, but I can imagine that a master and slave might both attend the same congregation, and that in the congregation, the slave had higher standing. Well, there wasn't enough of that to say that the structure, hierarchical structure of the Roman Empire was changed. But there was enough of that so that when the Roman Empire collapsed, what followed it was not a slave society. Now, it was a hierarchical society, but it's very important, I think, that in Christendom, with all of its many flaws and failures and all the rest of it, I don't want to romanticize any of these whom I'm talking about, but the peasants, the people who did the work, they had political, legal rights. Often they were abused terribly, they were exploited terribly. But in the teaching that they are human beings, not to be treated simply as instruments for somebody else, but that they had their own value, their own worth that must be respected by society, was implemented in the new society that arose out of the ashes of Rome. And that idea has persisted and spread. Now, there was a tremendous setback when Europeans, supposed to be Christians, began to interact extensively with indigenous people. The indigenous people were not treated in the way Christians or the Westerners treated each other. And they were very conscious of this, and they tried to find justification of it in the Bible, so that throughout the period of renewed slavery, I don't mean slavery had ever disappeared, but it was a minor factor. Then it became a major factor at the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern period. The slavery came back, and it came back in Christian countries. So the claim that something had happened has to be checked against something in reverse also took place. And I still think that there was a difference in the way people understood things. I'm not particularly proud of the fact that I come from a family that before the Civil War was very rich. And what it meant to be rich, wealth was mainly measured in slaves. They were slave owners. And two brothers wrote books. One of them was defending slavery from the Bible. The other was showing the legal structures that justified or allowed slavery. Now, books of that kind would not have been written in the Roman Empire. What I'm saying is that even in this huge backsliding, which treated especially Blacks as if they were not really human beings in the same way the rest of us are, there was a feeling this had to be justified in some way. There wasn't any feeling like that in the Roman Empire. So something remained, even in the worst of modern slavery, of the sense that human beings are something more than by nature. In the most objective sense, they are something more. And that the exploitation of their labor in slavery needed to be justified. And finally, once again, that understanding of human beings did put an end to slavery, and very gradually, very painfully operated to move toward equality among races. I think that we can say that Martin Luther King did more than any other one human being to implement, to give up political and social and cultural reality to the understanding that every human being is of value in and for herself or himself, is something that it is a reality that should be treated as a value, something worthwhile to be, something that should be cared for. And I think we do celebrate his life. We recognize that it was he who actually transformed globally the understanding of race after a period of several hundred years when race was not such a big issue in the Roman Empire. It was the sense of the gap between the civilized and the indigenous that created the huge problem in modern times. So I'm trying to say that, in fact, the movement that grew up around Jesus' message of God's love for everyone, every human being is a child of God, that has, over 2,000 years, transformed our understanding in such a way that when we exploit other human beings as if they were of no value in themselves, we at least have to think up excuses and reasons. And in fact, I think there is a great improvement over the days of when slavery was the normal condition for the majority of people. Now, that's what I mean by the resurrection that began in the apostles as they finally began to hear what Jesus had been saying to them all along. It has resurrected globally the status of human beings as ends in themselves and not merely means. Now, I will say very briefly something about the resurrection of nature. Earth Day is coming, and the existence of Earth Day symbolizes a transformation in the way in which human beings around the planet think of nature. Now, I'm not claiming that Jesus in any distinctive way contributed to that, but it was, after all, Christianity that spread the Bible widely. And of course, Islam is so dependent upon the Bible that I'm not really saying Islam played a lesser role in this respect. And the Bible has, at the very beginning, you would think a lot of people would be able to get through one chapter of the Bible. If they do, they get the Bible's main statement about the relation of human beings and the natural world. It was not implemented, but it was there in an underlying way. And what is there is, once again, that the creation has value in itself. The creation does not exist just for human use and enjoyment. By creation now, of course, that includes human beings, but I'm focusing now especially upon the natural world. And it's this deep sense, of course, was part of the total Christian message, not in any way distinct from the Jewish message. The difference simply being that Jews were not that interested in multiplying the number of Jews, and Christians were very interested in multiplying the number of Christians, so that the extension and expansion of the knowledge of this message was due to Christians rather than to Jews. So we can work our way around and say Jesus' resurrection, meaning the resurrection of the understanding of the apostles, has played a role in undergirding the fact that I think today, relatively few people are comfortable in saying that animals have no value in themselves. They're simply useful to us. We act as if that was the truth. We're a long, long way from implementing. But the biblical teaching is close to common sense. I mean, or I put it the other way. Human common sense is close to biblical teaching. One, what is created is worthy of respect and the treatment, good treatment. Two, human beings are not simply like all other aspects of creation. They have a control that no other species of life has. But this does not mean that they should ignore the fact that all the other creatures also have value. God sees it in every case. It's good before human beings arrive. But it is only when we have the whole, for which the human beings have a special responsibility, that God sees it as very good. And I think that pair is what we should be aiming at today. Don't waste, don't destroy it unnecessarily, don't damage it. Things are to be, the natural world is to be respected. But human beings do come first in value and have responsibility for the whole. We are not close to acting in that way. Modernity has had the worst record of any epoch in human history with respect to the natural world. And we are far more modern than we are Christian. But still, we do have an influence. We do have a role in shaping the deepest understanding. And if we do not destroy ourselves, it may be that nature will have a chance at being resurrected. Thank you.
Amen, and so be it. John Cobb, thank you so much.